This is a video record of our trip to Europe from July 9th to 27th, 2019. This is part 5, which covers our trip to Paris from July 23rd to 27th. The part 4 video ended with our second full day in Rome. The highlights on that day included the Vatican, St. Peter's Basilica, the Castel Sant'Angelo, and the special Vatican tour capped by the exclusive visit to the Sistine Chapel. On Tuesday, July 23rd, Robin and I left our Rome hotel and were driven to the Rome airport. At the airport, we caught our Air France flight to Paris. The flight took about an hour and a half. Like in London, I had booked a ride from the airport and a hotel room before we left home. In choosing our hotel, the only requirement I had, other than being a nice hotel, was that the hotel be in the center of Paris. Ultimately, this was the location of our hotel, the St. James in Albany, near the geographic center of Paris. Along with being near the center of Paris, the St. James was located within easy walking distance of the following Paris sites: the Place de la Concorde, the Louvre Museum with the Louvre Pyramid, the Arc de la Carrousel, and the Tuileries Garden. As an extra bonus, the hotel was just across the street from a metro subway stop. We arrived at the hotel at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. We checked in, and then after the usual paperwork, we walked through the hotel toward the elevator. The elevator was one of the smallest I had ever seen. The room was very nice, and it had something that would prove invaluable to us: this portable air conditioner. As it turns out, Paris would experience the worst heat wave in its history while we were there. Our hotel, like most other buildings in Paris, had no central air conditioning, so this little unit would allow us to sleep at night. The bathroom was the most unique in all our hotel stays. It was beautiful, with a sink, stand-up shower, and a tub with a shower. But there was no toilet. We couldn't find the toilet anywhere until we happened to open a little door to the right of the front door in the entryway of our room. We had thought it was a closet, but in fact it was our toilet and a small sink. It turns out that the hotel had renovated the bathroom, but it hadn't yet included the toilet. While Robin rested up, I explored our hotel. One surprise I found was this beautiful swimming pool. Unfortunately, we never had enough time to use it, though. Before we left home, I had booked an excursion to the Eiffel Tower for our first evening in Paris. After we had rested up, we had dinner, then we walked across the street to the metro station. We rode the subway to the stop just on the other side of the Eiffel Tower, arriving at about 7:30. The metro stop was about a half a mile from the Eiffel Tower. The plan was to meet our guide at the building on the left at 9 o'clock. We had arrived early on purpose, so we would have enough time to do a little bit of exploring and picture taking before our tour. We walked to the end of the walkway in this picture, then we started walking down the steps to get closer to the tower. As we got closer to the tower, they turned on the fountains over the reflecting pools, which made everything even more picturesque. Even though the real heat wave wouldn't start until the next day, it was still quite warm that night, and there were many people cooling off in the pools. As the time to start our tour approached, we climbed back up the stairs and walked to the place we would meet the tour guide. At this point, we wished that we had not gone exploring, as the walk down and back up the stairs had used up a lot of Robin's energy. To make matters worse, after we met our tour guide, she had our group stand while she droned on and on about the tower. Then we walked down the stairs and she had us stand again to wait for the lights on the tower to start twinkling. While this was beautiful, the standing used up even more of Robin's energy. Despite this, we were still able to marvel at how beautiful the tower looked, especially at dusk. It was like watching a movie. The tower got more beautiful as we got closer. The lights seemed to twinkle from every square inch of it. The twinkling only lasts for a few minutes and comes on at regular intervals. The twinkling stopped just after we reached the tower. As we walked under the tower, Robin got the following unbelievable pictures looking up through the middle of the tower. We finally arrived at the tower, but then we had to wait in line to get on the elevator, which meant more standing. We finally got on the elevator and rode up to the second level of the tower. Immediately after we got off the elevator, Robin just absolutely positively had to have something to drink. So I stood in line at this little snack bar for a half an hour to buy her a bottled water. After that, we were so tired that we only spent about 20 minutes taking pictures from atop the tower. Here are some of those pictures. This and the following pictures show the River Seine. Just above the river is the reflecting pools we saw earlier, and above that the meeting place for our tour. This picture is looking away from the river. This is a small merry-go-round at the base of the tower. It has a twin across the river. The white circular object is a Ferris wheel that's just opposite our hotel. I'll talk more about it later. When we were ready to go back down, we had to wait for the elevator, which of course meant more standing. By the time we got back on the ground, it was about 11:30. At this point, Robin was all walked out, so I hailed a taxi. The driver wanted $60 to take us to our hotel. I won't tell you what I told him, but it wasn't nice. A few minutes later, I stopped another cab who charged us $10. Along the way back to our hotel, the cabbie drove through the tunnel in which Princess Diana was killed. The gold statue on top of the tunnel is called the Flame of Liberty. It is the unofficial memorial to Diana. It only took about 15 minutes to reach the hotel. We went up to our room, collapsed into bed, and had the best night's sleep of the entire trip. The next morning, July 24th, we got our breakfast from the hotel buffet and went out to the patio to eat. We knew the day was going to be hot, and it was. Undaunted, we walked to the subway stop at the Place de la Concorde, where we caught the subway to the metro stop closest to the Basilica Sacré-Cœur. Sacré-Cœur is on top of the only hill in Paris. The last time we visited the Basilica, we walked up what seemed like 100 stairs. This time we got smart and used the funicular up to the Basilica. After we got off, we passed by this classic French car from the 1950s, the Citroën. Just after that was the Basilica. We walked to the entrance and then walked inside. Upon entering the Basilica, your attention is immediately drawn to the mosaic of Christ at the end of the nave. By the way, Sacré-Cœur means Sacred Heart, and thus the image on the chest of Christ. For me and Robin, this is one of the most beautiful churches in Europe. You may remember this statue of St. Peter inside Rome's St. Peter's Basilica from the Part 4 video. This was the statue with the feet worn smooth by visitors rubbing them for good luck. Well, Sacré-Cœur also has a statue of St. Peter, and his feet have also been worn smooth for the same reason. After we toured the Basilica, we walked outside and took in the view of Paris. It was a little hazy, but still quite a sight. Next, we walked down some of the small streets near the Basilica. A little bit further was Saint-Pierre de Montmartre. This little church was built in the 12th century, which makes it much older than Sacré-Cœur. It is one of the oldest surviving churches in all of Paris. One of the statues inside St. Pierre is that of Saint Denis, who was executed by the Romans on the site of St. Pierre in the year 258 AD. Legend has it that after his head was cut off, St. Denis picked it up and walked several miles preaching a sermon along the way. Indeed, Denis is the most famous cephalophore, that is, a saint who is generally depicted carrying his or her own head. Another statue in St. Pierre is, you guessed it, St. Peter. Popular guy, that St. Peter. We left St. Pierre and walked a few feet to the Place de Tertre, a famous square that has been a gathering place for famous artists for over 200 years. In the last few years, the artists have been slowly pushed to the edges of the square to make room for 2 dining areas. Since it was lunchtime when Robin and I arrived there, we decided to have lunch in one of those dining areas. Interestingly, the food is prepared in one of the buildings beside the square and brought to the table by the waiter. After lunch, Robin and I walked around the edge of the square, admiring the artists' work. I stopped at one of the tables and bought a small painting from this woman. This is the painting. Not museum quality, but I liked it. Just before we left the area, we walked by this restaurant, Le Cancelat. It was the hangout for all the famous artists of the 19th and early 20th century. Monet, Renoir, Degas, Toulouse-Lautrec, and Van Gogh, among others. Next, we made our way back to the metro stop where we caught the subway to our next destination, the Royal Chapel of Sainte-Chapelle. This chapel is on an island in the middle of the Seine River called Le Cité. The chapel is 2 blocks from the much more famous Notre Dame Cathedral. The Chapel of Sainte-Chapelle was completed in the year 1248. It is one of the least known gems of Paris and is overlooked by most tourists. The chapel is relatively small and on 2 levels. You enter on the first level where you buy tickets and souvenirs. Then you walk up a very old set of stairs and are greeted by this. Floor-to-ceiling stained glass windows around the entire circumference of the upper level. We left Sainte-Chapelle ready to set out for more sightseeing, but by this time it was getting too hot to continue, so we reluctantly decided to return to our hotel. That afternoon we rested up, then we went out looking for a restaurant to have dinner. But it was still very hot outside, and none of the restaurants within walking distance of our hotel had air conditioning. That situation forced us to go to Plan B for dinner. We walked around the corner from our hotel, found this mini-mart, and bought 2 pre-made sandwiches, 2 bottles of Diet Coke, and chips for dinner. A gourmet dinner if I ever had one. At dusk, the heat had dissipated enough for us to leave our hotel and walk over to the Tuileries Garden across the street. We first walked down to the Arc de Carrousel, which was completed in 1808 to commemorate Napoleon's military victories in Europe. Then we walked a little further to the Louvre Museum with its glass pyramid at its center. The pyramid was completed in 1989 and is now the main entrance to the museum. We then walked to the other end of the Tuileries Garden, stopping at the Place de la Concorde. In the middle of the Place de la Concorde is an obelisk. At the foot of the obelisk is this plaque, which marks the place of the beheadings during the French Revolution. You will recognize the names of two of the most infamous casualties of the guillotine, King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. From the Place de la Concorde you can see the sparkling Eiffel Tower and the main street of Paris, the Champs-Élysées. We walked back through the Tuileries Garden towards our hotel. The light at the end of the walkway is coming from the Louvre Museum. Here is the Ferris wheel we saw earlier from the Eiffel Tower. It is part of a traveling carnival that set up shop directly across from our hotel at the edge of the Tuileries Garden. We walked past the carnival just before returning to our hotel. The next day, July 25th, broke the record for the hottest day ever recorded in Paris, 108 degrees. We had breakfast and walked out of the hotel at about 9 o'clock. The heat was already unbearable, but we decided to venture out anyway. We walked across the street, got on a subway, and rode 2 stops to the beginning of the Champs-Élysées. We then walked to the top of the Champs-Élysées, which was only about a half a mile, but the heat made it seem like a walk of 10 miles. At the top of the Champs-Élysées is the Arc de Triomphe. We took some pictures of it. Then we crossed over to the other side of the Champs-Élysées and started walking back down the street. By this time we were both very thirsty, so we stopped at a little mini-mart and Robin got one of these slushy drinks and I got a Diet Coke. About halfway further down the Champs-Élysées, we found this Disney store and went in to do some shopping. After we finished at the Disney store, we went around the corner to this Burger King for lunch. After lunch, we walked a little further up the street to this department store called Monoprix. It is a chain store similar to our Target stores. By the time we came out, we knew the heat was going to be too much for us, so we walked back to the metro, rode back to our hotel, and hunkered in for the rest of the day. At around dinner time, it was still too hot outside to eat in any restaurant, so we returned to the same mini-mart, bought the same 2 ready-made sandwiches, Cokes, and chips, and dined again in our room. At around 8 o'clock that evening, Robin and I walked outside thinking we would stroll around the neighborhood. We got about 5 feet before we were hit by a wall of heat. It was still well over 100 degrees. We stopped, took one look at each other, and without a word, both turned around and walked back inside for the rest of the evening. The next day, July 26th, started out much cooler than any time since we arrived in Paris. In fact, it was even cloudy when we woke up. We had breakfast as usual. Then we caught a subway to our first destination, Luxembourg Gardens. When we got out of the metro station, it was actually chilly. The first thing we did was walk to the Luxembourg Palace, which is inside the gardens. The palace and gardens were built in the 17th century for Marie de Medici, the widow of King Henry IV of France. Just like almost everywhere else in Paris, the Eiffel Tower is usually in sight. This is one of the best pictures Robin took at the gardens. It clearly shows why the gardens are so popular with the locals. By the time we left the gardens, the clouds were looking darker and darker. Our next destination was the Latin Quarter, so we started walking toward it. Along the way, we passed this combination bookstore and music store and this specialty market. We continued to the Latin Quarter, home of several colleges and universities. The streets are all very narrow and filled with shops and restaurants. It is called the Latin Quarter because the universities in it used to use Latin to teach their students. By this time we were getting hungry, so we stopped at this restaurant for lunch. Before we even got a table, the sky opened up with a major cloudburst. The rain continued for several minutes, during which time Robin recognized a great scene when she saw it and shot this picture before the rain stopped. The restaurant was right across the river from Notre Dame Cathedral. So after lunch, we walked to a place where we could see the damage caused by the recent fire. To give you a better perspective of the damage caused by the fire, here is Notre Dame before the fire. Notice the roof, the spire, and the two stained glass windows. Now here is Notre Dame after the fire. Notice that the roof and the spire are gone, and the stained glass windows are covered by scaffolding. Each of the flying buttresses, that is the curved stone structures in the middle of the picture, are now supported by a wooden framework. Next is a picture of how the interior of the cathedral looked just after the fire. By now the rain had given way mostly to blue skies, so we walked a bit further along the river to get this picture of Notre Dame. One of the more iconic images of Paris, well, to me anyway, are the rows of stalls along the river's edge that sell many things, but mostly art. As we were starting to leave, I noticed a famous French landmark at the edge of the Latin Quarter. It is the Shakespeare & Company, one of the largest bookstores in Paris that sells mostly books in English. So we left the Latin Quarter, but before we returned to our hotel, I left Robin near Sainte-Chapelle, then I walked over to buy tickets for the river cruise we would take that night. On the way there, I passed by one of the many rental scooters we had seen in Paris. Yep, they have them there too. After I got our cruise tickets, we returned to our hotel and rested up. Later, we ventured out for dinner, but because the day had been cool, we knew that we would finally be able to go to an actual restaurant. We walked a few blocks from the hotel until we found this restaurant. It had menu items that suited both of our tastes, and the price was reasonable. What a treat! After dinner, we started back to our hotel. On the way there, we passed within sight of another Paris landmark, the Paris Opera House. Since our river cruise did not leave until 9:30, we had time to return to our hotel and rest up. At around 8:30, we left for the river cruise. The weather had turned chilly again with clouds threatening rain. Since this was our last night in Paris, we decided to go on the cruise anyway, rain or no rain. We arrived at about 9 o'clock. It looks earlier than that, but it doesn't get dark in Paris until after 10 o'clock. Just as we started walking down to the dock, our boat arrived. We were able to get seats in the back of the top level of the boat so we could stand up whenever we wanted to take pictures. The cruise had a live narrator describing the sights, but most of the audio I captured was the French portions of his descriptions. So I have removed all his narration and substituted just the sounds of the boat. The boat left the dock at exactly 9:25. I didn't shoot video until we reached the Eiffel Tower, so I have used Robin's still pictures in this video until we reached the tower. The first landmark we passed was the Louvre Museum on the right. After that, we saw the d'Orsay Museum on the left. Next was the Palais Bourbon on the left, which serves as a meeting place of the French National Assembly. Here we are approaching the Pont Alexander Bridge, arguably the most beautiful bridge in all of Europe. These alien-looking structures on our left belong to the Russian Trinity Cathedral. we cruised down to the Eiffel Tower. Once there, they very slowly turned the boat around, giving great photo opportunities. Then we started back up the river. The tower opened in 1889 as the entrance to the 1889 World's Fair. It is the most visited paid monument in the world. The tower is 1,063 feet tall, which is about the same height as an 81-story building. We again cruised under the Pont Alexander Bridge. In case you hadn't already figured it out, pont is the French word for bridge. We had taken this same exact river cruise several years before. Since that time, there has been an explosion in the number of permanently docked boats they use as restaurants. Here are two examples of that. During the evening, there are boats of all shapes and sizes plying the Seine River. Some, like this one, provide dinner cruises, and others like ours are just for sightseeing. Again, we passed the southwest corner of the Louvre Museum on the left. This is the Institute of France, which is a French learned society grouping 5 academies, including the Académie Française. We are approaching the island of Le Cité. Just to the left and around the corner from the trees ahead is the dock from which we left on this cruise. We take the fork to the right and will continue around Le Cité before returning to our dock. This is the Pont Neuf. It is also called the New Bridge, even though it is the oldest bridge in Paris. This is because it was the first modern bridge built in Paris, and at the time it was completed in 1607, it was a new bridge. And now we approach the darkened towers of the Notre Dame Cathedral. Normally, these towers, as well as the entire cathedral, are brightly lit, making them one of the most beautiful evening sights along the Seine. Naturally, none of the lights are lit in the post-fire era, making the entire setting look almost ghostly. It was about this time that a very light rain started, forcing me to shoot the rest of the video from under an overhang on the boat. In stark contrast to that of the darkened Notre Dame, we come upon a very common sight in Paris. People gathered in a totally party-like atmosphere. This happens all over Paris in summer, but it is at its most joyous along the Seine. Further along the river is another gathering equally as joyous as the one before it. Now we've made the turn around Le Cité and are heading back to the dock and the end of our cruise. At this point, I'm going to switch from my video clips to Robin's still pictures because they are quite beautiful. I will end this cruise with one final video clip. Keep an eye on the left arch. Look for a glimpse of the Eiffel Tower. There it is. In a few minutes we reached the dock and our cruise ended. After the cruise we walked to the metro and took the subway back to the stop nearest to our hotel. The exit from that stop is the decorated structure on the right in the picture. Just after we exited the metro, we were greeted by more people dancing and just having a good time. By the time we returned to our hotel, Robin and I had walked approximately 10 miles in our travels during the day. To say the least, we were pooped. The next day, July 27th, was the day we were scheduled to fly home. But ever since we left home on July 19th, I have been worrying about whether we would be able to catch this flight or not. Before we had left home, I had heard that our airline company, Norwegian Airlines, might be going out of business. If that happened while we were in Europe, we would be out of business. Later that morning, the car I had reserved arrived and took us to the airport. Luckily, everything was fine and our flight had not been canceled. I don't think I've ever been so happy to board an airplane in my life. We took off at 3:40 in the afternoon and had the same seats that we had had on the flight to London 12 days before. The flight took 11 hours and 20 minutes. We arrived in Los Angeles at 6 o'clock that same night.